but Bert, you see, the ball game is just about to start, and I gotta
Hold
go
it.
get my pitching
No,
arm
no,
all warmed up.
Ernie, if
Yes.
I do the dishes and you play ball, that's not fair. That is unfair.
Now, Bert, if you listen to me when I talk to you, that's fair.
Yeah, but Ernie, if you don't listen to me when I talk to you, that's not fair.
That's true, Bert.
If we listen to each other just because we care, that's fair, that's fair, that's fair.
All right, welcome back, folks. In our last video, we saw that Rawls wanted the state to be neutral between religions and other comprehensive doctrines, opening up public debate to all. But he said that it's morally incumbent upon us as citizens to be reasonable, which you could say means offering impartial reasons to our fellow citizens. Reasons, in other words, that are not partial to our own comprehensive doctrines, but that are convincing to them, our fellow citizens. Now, that led us to an interesting question of what we should do about those who are unreasonable, which is how we're going to start this video. And you'll see how this leads into Iris Marion Young's critique of Rawls. The question is the question of whether we should be tolerant of the intolerant. For instance, should we allow Nazis to march through the largely Jewish suburb of Skokie, Illinois, a famous American case, when the Nazis themselves wouldn't be reasonable allowing Jews to have civil rights or maybe even a right to life if they were in power? In Theory of Justice, Rawls's other famous book, he says that there's nothing that intolerant groups do to deserve our toleration of them. They don't promise to act reasonably. We might still decide to tolerate them in some way, which would be an exercise of our moral skills and would make us better at toleration. So to think of that, remember what he says in Political Liberalism, that modernity causes comprehensive doctrines to shift and become reasonable. So exercising toleration would be a way that we do that. But he says in Theory of Justice, they, the intolerant, have done nothing to earn that. The intolerant have done nothing reasonable to merit our attempts to cooperate with them, though we might still try. But then a really important question comes up for multiculturalists. Do we have to tolerate cultural groups that refuse to offer public reasons either? If citizens have to offer impartial reasons in the neutral public square, is the state necessarily stacked against anyone who would want to say, look, I can't do that. I can't state reasons that I don't fully believe in. My beliefs, my integrity require me to state and to work from principles that I fully believe to be true with a capital T, not to mention religious, philosophical, cultural, or traditional. And what about people who say, I don't have reasons to give. I have stories, personal reflections, feelings about what it's like to be dominated in this society of ours, emotions, concerns, love for the members of my community. Iris Marion Young asks, are all of those things, stories, feelings, personal perspectives, love, and so on, are all of those things to be excluded from this impartial public square that Rawls is imagining? Well, we'll get to her objections as the focus of this lecture, but first, just 90 seconds on what Rawls thinks impartial arguments will actually bring us. On the one hand, it doesn't seem that scary. He says fairness, and hence he calls his philosophy justice as fairness. So you should look closely at 22 to 26 to see more about how Rawls develops his definition of fairness. It isn't straightforward, but I'll suggest to you now the interpretation of Rawls that I think works best, at least the short interpretation of Rawls that works best. He makes 2 points, I think. One, with respect to the economic components of what he calls the basic structure, it seems that Rawls says that our public political ideals tell us that no one ought to be disadvantaged, at least in the choice of principles, by their socioeconomic position. So in other words, he says that we just think it's unfair if in choosing principles to regulate our economy, people chose on the basis of their wealth or income. And then he adds in there also their race or gender or their comprehensive doctrine. And again, he's saying these are things that we've just developed by participating in democratic societies. We think if people did this, they'd make principles that are partial to their own class or race or gender or so on. Now, second, with respect to the political, not economic components of the basic structure of society, such things as participation rights, personal freedoms, citizenship duties, and etc., he says, we also think that it's unfair that people should receive lesser voting rights, for instance, because of their race or gender. So, fairness here as well. But how could we get citizens to draw up principles in such a way that they just couldn't possibly benefit their own race, class, gender, or religion? It seems like anytime I make any decision, I'm influenced by these things. They're part of my own experience of the world. How can I not be influenced by them? Well, Rawls says that essentially we ought to engage in a thought experiment, something that he calls quite famously the original position. To put myself in the original position, I place myself metaphorically behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. I forget for a bit that I have a particular race, class, gender, and religion. I'm ignorant of it. I don't know it, at least for a moment. And instead of seeing myself as a particular person with particular beliefs and interests, I see myself instead simply as a person who is free and equal, which he keeps on repeating, or we might also say impartial. It seems kind of nice, doesn't it? It's got an almost meditative feel to it, right? Strip yourself of all of those things that make you partial and all of those things that set you and I at odds, and instead develop reasons that appeal impartially to your fellow citizens as well as to you. Think, as it were, above our differences. Well, Iris Marion Young says that this idea of impartiality as divorcing yourself from the particulars that make you who you are, well, it's not nice at all. She has an initial critique of this that leads then into a much deeper critique. So let's start with the initial critique. It's that Rawls has what she calls an atomistic conception of individuals, that they are all separable from society with identities that are separable from each other. And that then Rawls says we get a distribution of rights and material goods. Those are Rawls's two sides of fairness, the two things that I mentioned before. And she criticizes this on page 18 and 27 as the distributive paradigm, which she says Rawls and many others hold. She says, look, it's just not true. We don't have separable identities with interests that can somehow be served regardless of who we are. Instead, who we are is intimately tied up with how our interests end up getting served in the societies that we're a part of. So take, for an example, gender. Rawls would say this. He said, look, hey, if you don't want to be unfair between genders, then don't let anybody in the original position know what their gender is. Problem solved. They'll distribute material goods and distribute rights without regard to gender because they literally can't have any regard for it. They don't know it. But Young responds that what it means to be a woman, for instance, in a given society is tied up with the claims that people have made about unfair distributions of rights and material goods in the past. She says, you can't somehow forget about claims based on the maldistribution of resources in the past and then come up with a fair distribution of resources. Let's forget who everybody is and then just give them rights and economic goods. Fair within the society we really live in might require knowing that you're a woman and correcting past wrongs done against women. Then this leads to her second, deeper critique of impartiality. More than just asking us to ignore past distributive injustices, impartiality, she says, asks us to ignore what she calls institutional sources of domination and oppression. She talks about this on page 16. And already from our studies together, we should know to sort of perk up our ears when we hear words like institutional or systemic or structural and so on and so forth. She uses the word institutional. She must mean something different. People, she says, don't just want a share of material goods and an equal portion of rights. They want what she calls recognition for the fact that the institution of their societies have always looked down upon them, have always seen them as lesser, and they want justice for that. They want you to see it and recognize them as equals, as it were. So if you're told as Rawls might want to tell you, you can't know that you're Black or can't reference the fact that you're Black in impartial public discussions about justice, well, how could you address anything like structural, linguistic, class, or conflict-based sources of difference in your society? How could you address, Iris Marion Young asks, the sources of domination and oppression that work against you in society? To exclude knowledge of gender, race, class, even minority religious status, or any of the others is, for Young, to exclude the very detailed and necessary knowledge about how a lot of these things work in society, how a lot of things besides money and rights are stacked against certain people by the institutions of society. You need that detailed knowledge to recognize folks and to be just towards them. So she says we have to actually generate reasons about justice from smack dab right in the middle of the institutional context, she calls it, that we actually live in. So on page 22, she defines institutional context in this way. She says, it includes any structures or practices, the rules and norms that guide them, and the languages and symbols that mediate social interactions within them in institutions of family, state, and civil society, as well as the workplace. These are relevant to judgments of justice and injustice insofar as they condition people's ability to participate in determining their actions and their ability to develop and exercise their capacities. Important for making a link between that and our class is also page 28. There she talks about why she needs to combine structuralism and functionalism with the liberal approach in order to do the type of thinking about justice that she wants to do. So for one, she says the liberal approach is good at giving us paradigms to judge intentions and actions normatively as being just or unjust things. But she says it's got a flaw too. It gives us no sense of how those actions take place within a background of cultural and social meanings. Second, she says, well, the structuralist and functionalist approaches explain how those meanings came into existence and why they're hard to change, but they almost absolve us of moral responsibility because we didn't make the pattern and we repeat the pattern, according to structuralists, let's say, without any really conscious choice to do it. Explanation, Young wants to say, isn't enough. We need change, we need justice. So she says on page 29 that when we look at something like gender discrimination in the workplace, we must be able to judge it in some way. But it's not enough to ask whether people are paid fairly or have equal rights. Those are Rawls's only concerns. Against a backdrop of discriminatory ideas, she wants to be able to look at particular players within the company and say to them, you are responsible for changing this. You must change domination and oppression. Pay and rights, she wants to say, will not themselves bring about justice. Women cannot do and be all that they could do and be within this structure of ideas. So think back to her reference in that quote that I used before to people's ability to participate in determining their actions and their ability to develop and exercise their capacities. A liberalism like Rawls's, she says on page 97, reduces difference to unity and grants everyone universal citizenship. But she says that's precisely what has excluded women, Blacks, American Indians, and Jews. The liberal logic of identity, she says on page 100, gives arguments for why people should escape egoism and attain objectivity, all well and good. But then it tells anyone who makes arguments in public based on their own experience as a gendered, racialized, or otherwise excluded person that they are being egoistic or self-interested, and suggests to them that by fighting for themselves and for others like them, that's what they're doing, being egoistic or self-interested, or in Rawlsian terminology here, unreasonable. So to her, a Rawlsian seems to want to say, how could you expect me, who's not Black, to find some way to endorse from within my own reason a plan that is meant to benefit solely Blacks? How unreasonable of you. Only offer me arguments that appeal to me as a non-racialized person, whatever that is, whatever that looks like in the original position. So take a look at her critique of Rawls on page 100 to 102 to see how she does that. On page 106 and 108 to 110, she blames Rousseau for part of this as well. She thinks that he had said that it was kind of a binary. You can be egoistic or impartial. That's it, nothing in between. But I do want to raise one doubt about her analysis of Rousseau here. We saw last week that Rousseau definitely did denigrate egoism, a bad self-love, and he also said that some group interests, like cultural interests, do threaten impartial morality and are the source perhaps of all human ills. But, and we were always saying in that lecture, but he would not have actually divorced justice from self or group, because he also said that anything good in culture, morality, civilization, human nature, has to come also from self, and more appropriate, the other word he used for it, and from connection with others. So hence his idea that compassion for others was good, while pity was actually bad. Interaction with others could cause two different outcomes, he really said, one moral and one not moral. So how could we value self and others, interests and impartiality, individuals and group membership, reason and emotions? That question I wanted to suggest to you last week was already part of the Enlightenment debate. Rousseau, frustratingly for sure, seemed to endorse both sides of each of those binaries, which is what made it hard to interpret his text. But it also means that far from being a simple celebration of self, reason, economic interests, and etc., the older Enlightenment ideas were always pretty nuanced. Okay, now I just want to leave you with two reading suggestions from the syllabus. For a liberal defense against Iris Marion Young's claims, you might see the Amy Gutman article that is on the syllabus. Amy Gutman, now the president of Penn, but famous for her long career at Princeton. She argues on 199 that what she calls deliberative universalism, which is a somewhat Rawlsian idea, but with more allowance for people to bring themselves into public debate. But she argues that this deliberative universalism does not impose one unchangeable solution on the members of oppressed groups. She says deliberation within the bounds of what is reasonable, think Rawls here, provisionally resolves fundamental moral conflicts here and now, but not necessarily once and for all. So there is still room, she says, for the oppressed to keep making their claims within society. On the other hand, very much the other hand, Chandran Kukathas says that liberals shouldn't recognize difference, as Iris Marion Young wants us to, at all. He says on 691 that the liberal state should be indifferent to difference, fully neutral, as he calls it. To do anything else, he thinks, is to invite, not to resolve claims based on group grievances. He acknowledges on 693 to 694 that the majority group has no right to assimilate the minority group, but the minority group, he says, has no right to existence per se, and thus no right to resist assimilation. Well, they will resist, and they'll use politics to do that. They'll make claims of justice as well, but they may lose. That, he says, is the way of the world. And that minority group had previously assimilated others anyway. That, he says, is the way of the world. So here we have a series of liberal attempts to accommodate differences, to recognize differences, and so forth. As we move forward with other versions of multiculturalism for the liberal nation state, we'll study both liberal and non-liberal thinkers for the rest of our time together. As we move forward with those, they're going to build upon a lot of these questions that Rawls and Young and Gutman and Kukathas are asking us to ask about liberalism itself. So this is going to form a nice foundation for us to move forward with lots of different disputes over the course of this semester. And I look forward to getting into all of that with you. See you in class.